All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and thank you for joining us this evening. It's our honor to have Scott Snyder here this evening to discuss his most recent book, South Korea at the Crossroads. So now he has literally written the book on South Korea's diplomacy. Prior to this, he actually literally wrote the book on negotiating with North Korea, something that will be part of a very timely discussion this evening. Of course, I have my marching orders from people, so excuse me as I read some of these things off. Please note that we are on the record and that we are live streaming tonight. And while we encourage you to use your phones to live tweet and ask questions through our online platform, which should be noted on the sides here, that we do ask you to silence your phones. The address for the online questions is chi.cnf.io. We'll be taking those questions live when I come up to rejoin the conversation at about 6 or 10 after, and we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes of questions with our author. For nearly a century, the Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Of course, views expressed here are that of the author and do not necessarily represent institutional positions of the Council. Before I turn it over to Scott, I first want to give a brief introduction. He is the Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, based in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining CFR, he held positions at the Asia Foundation, Pacific Forum CSIS, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the Asia Society. He received his BA from Rice University and his MA from Harvard. He was also a Thomas G. Watson Fellow at Yonsei University. After tonight's program, Scott will be right over there signing copies of his book, South Korea at the Crossroads. And for now, please welcome me in joining Scott Snyder.
Good evening. It's really a great pleasure to be here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I really appreciate this new auditorium, which looks like a wonderful space. And of course, the topic of Korea has been in the news a lot over the course of the past couple of months. And so I'm really pleased to have a chance to come and talk about my book. Even overnight, it seems that there is some very interesting and potentially significant new news about the inter-Korean relationship. And that's actually what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about as part of what I researched and wrote about South Korean foreign policy and the factors that shape the direction and nature of South Korean foreign policy. That's really the main topic of my book and my research. And you know, it's really interesting. South Korea is just in such a tough neighborhood, geopolitically, geographically. Facing a North Korean nuclear threat, caught in the midst of rising rivalries between China and Japan, and kind of ducking in the war of words between Trump and Kim Jong-un. And now we have this twist where the South Korean president is trying to put the U.S. and North Korea together in some way. And so it's really interesting. And in fact, before I go too far, I really should thank my publicist, Kim Jong-un, because he has done everything to make this book relevant. Last year in Korea, they were talking about Korea passing as they saw all this action between Washington and Pyongyang. And there were real concerns about whether South Korea was going to be left out. And then on January 1st, Kim Jong-un, made this peace offer to try to negotiate participation in the Pyeongchang Olympics, along with a guarantee that the Olympics wouldn't be disturbed. Only 3 weeks previous to that, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, was warning athletes and spectators about the risks of going to Pyeongchang following the November 29th nuclear test. So January 1st, Kim Jong-un makes this offer. January 2nd, my book comes out. And the book is obviously entitled South Korea at the Crossroads, and Kim Jong-un has managed the gap on denuclearization between Washington and Pyongyang. And so I want to really dig into some of the South Korean domestic political debates, but I think in order to do that, it's important to focus in on Panmunjom and the demilitarized zone, which is really the main symbol that we have of the tragedy of Korea's division. Having suffered as a colony of Japan, end of World War II, Koreans on the day that Japan surrendered thought that that was a day of liberation, and then they found themselves occupied by Soviet and U.S. forces respectively, and divided. And so, really I think that Panmunjom, the DMZ, is the symbol of that division. It's where the armistice was negotiated that ended the fighting. It's also, you'll recall, a couple of months ago, the North Korean soldier who crossed the DMZ right at Panmunjom, took fire from some of his own North Korean compatriots and then was rescued, and we found out that he had all sorts of parasites and is now in South Korea. But most interesting, it's where the talks that enabled North Korea's participation in the Olympics to occur, and it is the place where the two Koreas have apparently agreed that Kim Jong-un is going to come for a summit next month. And so this is a place that is evocative of division. It's also a place that generates potential hope. But also it's a place that my Korean colleague was talking about that illustrates some of the generational challenges related to Korean attitudes, South Korean attitudes toward North Korea. He was telling me about the visit that he and his family took to Panmunjom. And usually Americans or internationals go to Panmunjom. South Koreans usually don't go for a variety of reasons. Seemed had a chance. One of the early ones, I think, that evokes the progressive view was right after the end of the Cold War, back in 1990, 91, 92. And at that time, there was Korea was a new democracy. The president was a former general, but who had won a plurality in the election, named Roh Tae-woo, and he adopted a policy called Nordpolitik. And basically the strategy was to normalize relationships after the Seoul Olympics with Beijing and Moscow as a way of trying to get to Pyongyang and to try to achieve some kind of progress on unification. And at that time, his administration adopted what was called the Korea National Community Unification Formula. It drew from liberal and conservative views. And interestingly enough, it is still the official unification policy of South Korea today. And it really did envision a kind of gradual process involving a federation or a confederation, some kind of political union, some kind of exchanges and cooperation. And at that time, the two Koreas actually negotiated, I think, what you could argue is the most comprehensive vision for Korean unification process, because they established this agreement on reconciliation, non-aggression, exchanges, and cooperation. It contained all the arms control arrangements and tension reduction agreements that, frankly, we want to see as part of a gradual process. Only one problem: emergence of the North Korean nuclear issue, and actually U.S. concerns about North Korea's nuclear program at that time really, I think, cut short that moment. And then very shortly thereafter, Kim Il-sung died, and North Korea had a famine, and we came to the conservative moment under Roh Tae-woo's successor, Kim Young-sam. And at that time, following Kim Il-sung's death, many of the South Korean intelligence analysts had predicted that, after the founder of the regime dies, the regime will collapse. There's no way that the son will be able to maintain support. And so the South Korean then President Kim Yo-jong started to refer to North Korea as a broken airplane. And there was this narrative about how South Korea needed to plan for a soft landing. And indeed, with the famine and really with the cutoff of aid from China and the Soviet Union, the end of the Soviet Union, North Korea really was suffering during that time. But it ended up surviving. Ironically, it was the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s that brought a new administration in, a liberal administration into power in South Korea for the first time under Kim Dae-jung. He had a policy called the Sunshine Policy, which really envisaged promoting economic cooperation between North and South Korea as a way of trying to transform and integrate North Korea into the region economically and gradually change politically. He was the first South Korean president to meet his North Korean counterpart in Pyongyang in the year 2000. Really, to tell the truth, the background factor that I think made a gradual unification process suddenly desirable was the fact that the Asian financial crisis meant that South Korea didn't have the money to envisage being able to manage a unification process. But also it led to this dramatic change in terms of an integration process that was going to be led by progressives. And then I think there was one other conservative moment, really under the previous president, Park Geun-hye, who ended up being convicted of corruption, but at one time, she was talking about the unification jackpot. And really, again, post Kim Jong-il's death and the young leader, Kim Jong-un, emerging to try to consolidate his power, there was a narrative and an idea that unification was imminent. And so she established a presidential unification preparation committee. Of course, we know the end of the story. Park Geun-hye is in jail, Kim Jong-un is in power, and so that didn't necessarily work out. But what I find really interesting is that on both sides of this struggle, in terms of competing visions for unification, neither one has fully succeeded, and there was a former South Korean unification minister who I think actually got it exactly right when he made the observation that actually whatever our plans for Korean unification, unification is not something that we can reach out and grasp. It is something that will come to us. And I would argue that unification may be something that will come to South Korea whenever, regardless of what South Korean public attitudes toward unification might be. Now we're at a really interesting moment, I think, because if unification is going to come to the peninsula, not by what happens in Seoul, it means it's going to come as a result of something that happens in Pyongyang. And what I'm really focusing on is that North Korean choices influence the prospects for any kind of unification policy. And I would argue that there are two fundamental choices that Kim Jong-un is able to make that will shape the direction and prospects for either unification or reconciliation. And one of the choices is in the economic realm, the question of whether or not he is going to be an economic reformer or whether he's going to pursue economic autarky as a way of strengthening his own control, but under isolation. And the other is whether to be hostile towards South Korea or friendly towards South Korea. And so we're right at a moment, I think, where North Korean policy may be on the cusp of change. We have to wait and see. But I think it's important to keep in mind that here we are in March. 3 months ago, the way that South Koreans military were able to communicate with North Koreans across the DMZ, there was only one way to do it, and that was by using a bullhorn. Okay, and one of the effects of the warming in relations around the Pyeongchang Olympics has been that the two Koreas are reestablishing communication channels. And even in the announcement today from Seoul of the result of the meetings that the South Korean National Security Advisor led with Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, they announced that they were going to try to establish a leader-level hotline between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. And so that would be such a significant upgrading in terms of communication channels if it can be established. And of course, that's the challenge, if it can be established, because Moon has to manage expectations in this divided domestic environment. Even the idea of having another summit with Kim Jong-un is controversial. Conservatives obviously are not going to be for that because they have a different vision of what unification would look like that is different from reconciliation. And so that's one obstacle that the South Korean president has. But the other one is now trying to play the role of being a kind of intermediary between Washington and Pyongyang. And really, I think that this is the most fascinating aspect right at this moment, because the South Korean president, South Korea is an ally of the United States, Pyongyang is a threat, and yet here the South Korean president is, if he wants to improve the relationship between Pyongyang and Seoul, he also has to find a way to improve the relationship between Pyongyang and Washington. And that one obviously is the more difficult one, given the, how shall I put it, the penchant for uncertainty maximization that the current administration has exhibited, especially as related to policy toward North Korea. You know, the probability curve has just been flattened under this administration, to the extent that I think the president wants to keep everybody guessing. Is he going to go to war, or is he going to make a deal? And you could see that even in statements that he made today with the Swedish prime minister. And in tweets that he made. And so you can imagine how challenging this must be. The United States has been South Korea's ally, its security ally. It has been South Korea's protector for decades. Yet, some of the things that have been coming out of Washington, like the idea of a bloody nose strategy, well, from a South Korean perspective, that's not going to preserve South Korea's security. That's potentially endangering to South Korea's security. And likewise with North Korea, the nuclear issue is a big problem for South Korea. It's engendered a debate in South Korea about whether or not South Korea should get a nuclear weapon of their own in order to kind of even the playing field. And I don't think that South Korea is about to do that. I think for the time being they're going to rely on the U.S. extended deterrent. But you can feel the weight that the South Korean president must feel. Earlier last year he said, well, any decisions about war on the Korean Peninsula, I'm going to have to be consulted. And now, because of Kim Jong-un's outreach, Moon is right in the middle. And so he has to find a way to, basically I think that what Moon wants to do is to establish a pathway between Washington and Pyongyang that at present currently is blocked. It doesn't exist. And that is because we've seen the ratcheting up of tensions between Washington and Pyongyang as North Korea develops a nuclear and missile capability, potentially to be able to strike the United States with a nuclear device. That has engendered a very strong response and debate in Washington over whether we can accept vulnerability to North Korean nuclear weapons in the hands of Kim Jong-un. What that has done, if you're in South Korea, is it has blocked the critical pathway that is your preferred pathway. It's the pathway of peaceful denuclearization. And so what Moon needs from Pyongyang is a commitment to denuclearization. What he needs from Washington is a commitment to be peaceful in order for the preferred pathway of South Korea to be feasible. The big challenge, of course, is that, as the ally and weaker partner, how does Moon manage Washington? And then, at the same time, dealing with North Korea, which has basically been notoriously untrustworthy in terms of being willing to fulfill commitments, how do you manage Pyongyang? And so I think that's what actually Moon is about. That's what the announcement this morning was about. Very strikingly, that's the reason why the leader of the delegation to Pyongyang that Moon sent as his special envoy was the national security advisor within his government, and not the unification minister or the head of the intelligence services went along with the national security advisor. But basically the job is to put, not only to forward inter-Korean relations, but to put Pyongyang and Washington together. So what we're going to see later this week is actually a massive expansion of the levels of numbers of people who have direct communication with both Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. Because the National Security Advisor, Chung Woo-young, is going to join Dennis Rodman in this very exclusive club. The good thing is that Chung Woo-young may know something about diplomacy and about how to actually try to put Washington and Pyongyang together, but he has to deal with a challenging partner who really wants to further the idea that the U.S. is unpredictable, but shouldn't do it enough that it undermines South Korean assurance in the credibility of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And for Moon, I really do believe that in order to move forward, in both of the previous instances where there was an inter-Korean summit, in both cases, the North Korean nuclear program was bounded in some way. Back in the year 2000, when Kim Dae-jung visited Pyongyang, the U.S.-North Korea agreed framework was in place. And in 2000, when No Moo-hyun went to Pyongyang, there was a six-party talks negotiation in which the North Korea had committed to steps toward denuclearization. And so I do believe that Moon needs Trump to help bound the North Korean nuclear program. And we're about to embark on a very interesting journey in terms of whether or not, now that North Korea is much further along on this path, that's actually possible. And so I think that's what's really going to be tested. So I think I'm going to stop there. I hope that I've talked long enough to generate questions about this topic, and happy to address any aspect of the evolution of South Korean foreign policy, relations with the U.S., North Korea, where South Korea fits in the region. I'll stop there. Thanks.
As we move into the Q&A session, I'll ask that everyone kind of follows the three good rules of question asking. Number one, please identify yourself. Number two, please be concise. And number three, please be sure that your question ends with a question mark, perhaps the most important part there at the end. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question, and then we'll open it up. Scott, you talked a little bit about the South Korea being between North Korea and the U.S. But if you look at the book cover, it's clear a red band and a blue band. The suggestion there is that South Korea is actually between the United States and China. This is a conversation that goes on back for 5, 7 years, maybe even longer than that, about is Korea going to face a strategic choice of the U.S. perhaps withdrawing from the region and China coming up to power. So what is your position on this? Where is South Korea headed, and what is in its best interest, if we can say that?
Well, I have an entire chapter that I wrote and almost a separate presentation, but I'll try to give the Cliff Notes version. Along with the urgent challenge of dealing with the North Korean expanding nuclear threat, there is the longer-term challenge that South Koreans see of basically dealing with an emerging power that is expanding its influence, China, at the same time that it has its security and alliance relationship with the United States. And so South Korea, like many of China's neighbors in the region, has found itself dependent on China for economic growth while dependent on the U.S. for security. And so the question really is, under what circumstances, if any, would South Korea adjust its policies and maybe consider China as a kind of alternative security guarantor? And I really tried to dig into that. It turns out at present that I think the likelihood that South Korea would shift is pretty low, in part because China has made itself kind of inexplicably distant from that prospect. There's a lot of tensions in the China-South Korea relationship. And a lot of those tensions have come as a result of China's response to a mid-course missile defense system named THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Air Defense, that the U.S. deployed in South Korea over Chinese objections last year. And the Chinese basically decided to retaliate economically and politically against South Korea for allowing that deployment to occur. But it's kind of hard to understand why China would do that, because when China looks at the North Korea issue, they think about U.S. influence. And at least one Chinese analyst, has said to me, well, if we can't have a North Korea buffer, then we just need a Korea buffer. But if you're going to pursue that strategy, then you should be friendly to South Korea. And China has not been friendly to South Korea. And so as a result, I think that the likelihood of the U.S.-Korea alliance being put into play at present is actually much lower. And anxieties about China in the South Korean public have actually paralleled improvements in South Korean support for the relationship with the United States over the course of the past decade.
Yes, this woman here in the middle. There's a microphone coming, so please wait. Thank you.
I'm wondering about the Una Malkinson. I'm wondering about the support in South Korea that Moon has. Is he comfortable with his people, or are they trying to unseat him?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, President Moon came to power in a very unusual special election that occurred as a result of the impeachment of the previous president. It was on a very short timeline, only 60 days from the Constitutional Court's judgment to the election itself. And he won against two other major candidates. There were several others with only a 41% support rate in the election, but his public approval ratings since he was elected as president have been up in the 70s for the most part. And so he has retained pretty strong approval, including from people who didn't vote for him, people on the conservative side, because he's taken a very pragmatic approach so far in terms of both I think his domestic governance policies and his foreign policy. And so one of the interesting things I think over the course of the past week or so that we've seen actually with the North Korean engagement is, first we saw a little dip in Moon's public approval before the Pyeongchang Olympics, in part because some South Koreans felt that he was being too welcoming to North Korean participation. Conservative critics of Moon started to call the Pyeongchang Olympics the Pyongyang Olympics. And so, that was kind of evidence of the criticism. And then also some young people were upset about the unified hockey team. And then there were some other issues related to South Korean policy on cryptocurrencies and an effort by the South Korean government to crack down that kind of dipped his public approval ratings. But they've kind of bounced back for now. He has some political capital to burn as long as he's over 70. And I think the really interesting question is going to be where and how is he going to choose to use that political capital? On the one hand, South Korea has some very challenging domestic economic issues that really require the government to come in and take a stern view and push reforms. But there are also a lot of obstacles to being able to achieve near-term success or as a result of pursuing those policies. And then, on the other hand, he's committed to trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between Washington and Pyongyang. And that could also involve potentially spending some political capital. And so I noticed last week that Moon, for the first time, publicly made a criticism of the U.S. as having set the bar for denuclearization too high with North Korea. Very interesting because, from May of last year to March of this year, that's actually the first time that he has publicly criticized the U.S. He's been very focused on maintaining alliance solidarity, and I think that has been one of the sources of his continued ability to maintain high levels of public support.
The gentleman down here in the black sweater.
Robert Harris is my name. Thank you. There's a question coming. It's my opinion that nothing would happen to the unification efforts unless China allows it to happen. And I think they don't trust the presence of the U.S. Army being there. I think if the United States would pull out their forces, I think China does not want, if there was a unification, having American soldiers right at their border. And I don't really know why we're still there. You mentioned before that South Korea is the 11th or 12th economic power in the world. Why can't they have their own defensive? They can certainly buy armaments from us and so on, but why do we have to have all these people there? Do you agree with that philosophy?
Well, the U.S. has made a long-standing security commitment to South Korea's defense, and I think that the biggest challenge related to that issue, it's not North Korea's conventional power, it's actually North Korea's nuclear program. And so in a way, I think the nuclear program, the nuclear development, has reinforced and is keeping the need for a U.S. security commitment to South Korea. Does it have to come in that form? It may not have to come necessarily in that form, but at present, I think that the U.S. Will continue to maintain that commitment in cooperation with South Korea. One interesting issue is whether or not the U.S. and South Korea might begin to ease some of the manifestations of that presence if North Korea is willing to cooperate on denuclearization. And then, interestingly, Secretary of State Tillerson, as part of a four no's policy toward North Korea, has actually said one of the things that we are committed to, the U.S. government, is not to move north of the 38th parallel, which is really designed to try to provide some assurance to China. But there is a fundamental, really the core issue of difference between the U.S. and China as related to the Korean Peninsula is the question of longer-term end state. China wants a Korean Peninsula that is friendly to Beijing. The U.S. has signed on with South Korea to the idea of a democratic market economy-led unification.
If I may, if I were South Korea, I would look at what's happening economically there now. China just announced they're spending $600 million in creating an infrastructure to unite all the countries surrounding China. I would assume that that kind of futuristic economic development would definitely benefit a country like South Korea, and they would be more towards they never really, Korea and China are not natural enemies as opposed to China and Japan. So they could reconcile much easier. Correct me if I'm wrong, please.
Yeah. So there's several different issues. One is that, Korea does have a historical experience with Beijing that goes beyond the post-war experience in which Korea played a kind of tributary role to Beijing, which at that time was the center of the kind of civilizational center for Asia. Some South Koreans would object to being in that situation again. And there is, I think, an impulse to try to, maintain at the present time, going with the alliance with the United States is still, I think, from a South Korean perspective, the better way to go, because China is not yet, the critical issue is China is not yet the global rule maker. I think that if China were to become the global rule maker, then it's entirely plausible to imagine that South Korea would shift and adopt its traditional approach of being, having a close relationship with the most dominant power. And so that would be the factor, I think, that would drive that kind of shift, actually. And we are beginning to be in a situation where South Korea is thinking in the back of its mind about, is this going to happen? But it hasn't happened yet. And so with regards to some of the Chinese efforts to reach out to its neighbors, South Korean attitudes are kind of mixed right now, because South Korea wants to be inside the tent in terms of participating as a partner in those projects so that they can make money. But they still, frankly, in the global economy, they're facing a huge challenge from China. And they're worried that as China grows and becomes more central, that there's going to be less space for South Korean companies that are just going to be swallowed up. So we look at sectors like shipbuilding or even auto manufacturing, or cell phone manufacturing, and South Korean successful companies, they're feeling the breath of the Chinese competitors that are doing it at lower cost. And so at present, I think that those are issues that are kind of brakes on the possibility that South Korea would kind of shift over and be in China's orbit. But longer term, if China becomes more dominant than the United States, then I think there's absolutely going to be tensions, and I think that some South Koreans are beginning to see that, and they are beginning to think about how to prepare for it.
The gentleman here in the glasses.
China and North Korea historically has a very good relationship until recently, when it becomes not as good, with the rumor that China is trying to replace the Kim regime, Kim Jong-un. So as a result of this deteriorating relationship, North Korea has tried to be less economically dependent on China, which could possibly lead to the explanation that, with, what's going on today, in which, North and South Korea are having an improving relationship. So with that, prospect of improving relationship between the North and the South, do you think that would be like a dramatic changing dynamic in the Korean Peninsula moving forward with a diminishing role that China is playing? Or maybe that could be the other way around, in which the President Xi Jinping of China is sort of consolidating power in China. Do you think he's going to play a role in the future to sort of be more influential in the Korean Peninsula in the long term? And with the U.S. in the middle of all this, how do you think all that is playing out in the future? Thank you.
Yes, the China-North Korea relationship has suffered in part because, Xi Jinping clearly is not supporting Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un doesn't appear to be willing to work very closely with Xi Jinping. This is especially strange because North Korea is so dependent on China economically. All of its goods and energy, virtually is coming from China. And so it really shows the extent to which Kim Jong-un strategically has taken China for granted. And really, in a way, the head-scratching thing is that China, even under Xi Jinping, has put up with it. And I think that you're right that, it doesn't make sense. And that there probably must be some alternative policy that could come from Beijing at some point in the future. I think that China overall, in its relationship with both North Korea and South Korea, is underperforming because of the perceptions of risk that would accompany any possible alternative changes. And then also, it was very notable in Kim Jong-un's New Year's address. He talked about the United States not very kindly, and he talked about South Korea very positively, but he really didn't spend any time at all talking about China. And so I think that also kind of sends a message that North Korea is all in on self-help for now. As China has actually gone along with the United States in terms of sanctions implementation, we've seen this outreach to South Korea. And it'll be very interesting to see whether anything comes of that, because ironically, historically, Koreans have thought, well, the major powers really aren't supportive of unification. That might be the one card that Kim Jong-un thinks he can try to play in the current environment in order to try to fend off great power intervention.
I want to take a question from our digital platform. In your talk, you talked a little bit about the differing generational views on North Korea within South Korea. Could you elaborate on that? Perhaps you mentioned that people in their 20s are less favorable towards reunification. What's driving this?
Well, I think the main driver for changes in generational views is related to the differing generational socialization experiences that have occurred in Korea. And you have to remember that Korea's economic transformation was just so rapid, one of the most rapid transformations in the world, that we can actually see pretty stark generational differences in attitude between the grandfather generation, I would kind of call the war generation, and they also had a direct experience with living memory of the idea of a unified Korea. Maybe they've got family in the North that they haven't been able to see. Then you've got a kind of a development generation, and that generation actually has been more focused on thinking about how to it's divided, but how to break out of the kind of war mold and the kind of Cold War mode. And actually has been more favorable, generally speaking, toward the idea of looking hard at the possibility of cooperation with North Korea. I think some in that generation have become disillusioned as they've seen Kim Jong-un move in a different direction. And then the younger generation, the modern generation, basically they've just experienced South Korea. They've got South Korea pride. They really don't put much stock into the idea of a broader, ethnically homogeneous national concept. And they really are also concerned about changes in society in South Korea, and they see a huge potential financial burden associated with the idea of unification with the North. In fact, at a similar event to this one, a young Korean overseas student stood up and made exactly that point to me in the Q&A.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. I'd like to take these together. If we could have the woman in the back, Hillary, and then the man in front, and then you can answer those together. Hillary first, please.
Yes, among those who oppose unification in South Korea, is there any sort of consensus as to the type of relationship they would like to have with North Korea, or is that fairly fragmented?
Okay, my question actually follows on that. There's so much talk about unification, but given the differences in the 2 Koreas, it seems like that's almost like a pipe dream to even think about reunification. It seems like there are too many other areas that in my opinion, and I'd like you, and I want your, that they could be expanding on that would be worthwhile at this point.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that the idea of Korean unification has been politically correct in South Korea and in North Korea for such a long time, and we're actually only now getting to the point where there are potential challengers to that idea. And I think most of them are coming from younger generation that questions the practical expediency of, really cost related to that kind of project. And as a result, you could make an argument that, actually for a long time, there's been the rhetorical policy of unification, but the real objective of a lot of South Korean governments as they've pursued their unification policies has really been peaceful coexistence. Because peaceful coexistence is really the sine qua non, that's the essential condition that South Korea needs in order to be able to maintain its prosperity and its security. And at one time, I even joked with some of my friends who work in the Ministry of Unification that they really should change their ministry's name to the Ministry of Peaceful Coexistence. And of course, Ministry of Unification, also reflects the idea that, this project of unifying a divided state, it's such an outlier. I mean, my poor friends at the Ministry of Unification don't have counterparts anywhere else in the world because other states are not grappling with that issue. And so they have their own challenges. Really, their counterparts are all, with North Korea, but that project, as named, is probably receding in terms of likelihood.
And here we have time for one more question. In fact, I'll go ahead and ask that question myself. So we've talked a lot about North Korea, and of course there's been a lot of news, and this is kind of one of the first times where we've seen someone other than North Korea have a lot of the initiative, where they may have kind of set the stage for this with the Olympics, but now it looks like President Moon has gone out and really going to try to get the initiative, and how do we hold on to it? What has to happen in South Korea and what has to happen in Washington so that we can continue to set the terms for how we're going to engage with North Korea? And as a follow-up, what is your prognostication for the success of the coming talks?
Okay. Well, I mean, the South Korean president is really, I think, walking a kind of tightrope between Pyongyang and Washington. He needs help from both sides. He faces risks that Pyongyang is actually trying to divide Seoul and Washington. And so really the objective of peaceful denuclearization is the best objective that enables him to try to put the U.S. and North Korea together while fending off the risks of some kind of North Korean efforts to divide the U.S. or to weaken the alliance. And so I was thinking about this actually on the way in. What are the roles that South Korea really is trying to play? Well, facilitator is one role that I think we see. I don't think it's advisable, though, for South Korea to try to be a mediator. In the end, I think the U.S. and North Korea can do that. It's trying to be a good alliance partner, but the question is, we have common objectives for denuclearization, but we're going to be tested on means. What's the means by which we achieve that? And then thirdly, weirdly, the least desirable role that I think South Korea as an aspiring middle power really wants to overcome, but that I think actually turns out to be a real role. Actually, South Korea is a hostage to North Korea because of the threat from North Korea, and it's also, in an odd sort of way, a hostage to the United States because of the alliance. And so, in a weird sort of way, breaking out of that hostage role and redefining it, in some ways, is the biggest challenge. And what is going to happen? I mean, in a way, the worst potential thing that could happen would be that Moon's initiative with North Korea fails, and as a result, proves to others that the only way to deal with North Korea would be through an approach that focuses on regime change. And the best case scenario would actually be that he is successful in reopening this closed road called peaceful denuclearization, and then bringing the U.S. and North Korea together along on that road.
All right, everyone, that wraps up today's program. There will be a cash bar in the back. The reception will continue. Books will be for sale with Scott signing, so please feel free to stick around. Thank you.